Well, as the drought continues unabated in many communities along our eastern seaboard in particular, last week the federal government moved to head off growing criticism about a lack of sustained support by adding an extra $100 million into local infrastructure projects and drought relief, lifting the total number of local councils involved in the program to 123. With a number of towns across Australia projected to run out of water before the end of the year, and this fight we've now seen in Victoria about not building dams due to climate change, things are really coming to a head. In my week off last week, if there was one consistent issue that people raised with me in the street as I got around New South Wales and Victoria, it was water. Dams and how we can and must do better to harvest the water that we're blessed to receive every year in areas where we don't need so much of it and get it to the areas where we do. And there's a lot of green tape, development green tape, as you know, involved in all of that. Now, one man determined to bang heads if necessary to get this all moving is New South Wales Deputy Premier and National Leaders John Barilaro, who joins me now. John, let's start with the issue of drought and dams, and we'll get into planning issues and concerns you have, particularly over a recent decision to knock back a coal mine and many hundreds of jobs in New South Wales. Let's start with dams. I'm in the great state of Victoria here tonight. Dams here are off the table because of climate change. Now, I would have thought that would be a motivator to start building dams if you're worried about water shortages in the future. What's the problem? What's our phobia with dams around the country? What's driving the fact that we're just not building dams like we used to, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, good evening, Peter. Look, firstly, for those in Victoria, they want to use the climate change argument. I mean, that is the reason you build dams, because you're talking about the extremes of the climate. We'll have drier, longer periods, but we'll also get wetter, longer rainfall. And if you go back to 2016 here in New South Wales, we had floods and all our storages were full. 3 years on, our storages are almost empty. And if that's not the argument why we need to build more storage, more dams, it's about actually holding more water for times of long, dry droughts. And I think the Victorians have got this upside down. And what it really shows is it's driven by ideology. And that has always been the case. That's why we haven't built dams, significant dams in this state or in this country for over 30 years, because we've allowed the Greens to dictate with the balance of power in upper houses and in senates. And we haven't been able to get on with building the infrastructure to future-proof regional and rural New South Wales. And, the Victorians are stuck on ideology. We're not. We'll get on what we believe is right, and that's the push that I've been talking about for the last few weeks in relation to how do we cut through the red and green tape so we can build these dams, not just talk about it, but get bulldozers in the ground.
One of the issues too is local councils. A lot of them are dominated by the green side of politics. They use local councils as an incubator to get people skilled up to then run for a state seat or federally for the Senate or something like that. I know your party, the Nationals, I know the Liberal Party don't tend to run candidates or badged candidates in state or local councils. And I think that's got to change to really slow down the growth of green tape. But just on the issues of dams, forget regional Australia for a moment. Look at our population growth. We've hit 25 million people decades earlier than we thought we would. If for no other reason than the growth in population that seems unabated, particularly in our big cities, John, how can we get dams moving, and how can we get beyond this constant talk we're hearing that we need them into actually getting the bulldozers moving?
Yeah, look. The talk that you'll hear politicians, you've heard me, we write about it, we talk about it, and I don't mind that. I mean, we've also got to normalise the conversation about dams, because for decades we've actually talked down the idea of building dams. So one way, we've got to have a conversation with the community so we can bring them on the journey. So when you'll hear politicians talk about it, that's part of making sure the community are on side.
Fair point.
Yeah, so they're listening. But the reality is that we'll also be judged at some point, and that point is now. We learnt nothing from the Millennium Drought. This is the drought that is the reminder that we need to build dams. And that's why, a couple of weeks ago, I started the conversation about truncating red and green tape. We're doing some work in New South Wales. We'll need the feds to do that. And credit to Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister. We've had a conversation between both the state and the federal government, the Premier, myself, the Deputy Premier and the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, about exactly what we need to do. And there'll be more to be said. So we will be judged in this term of government, both federal and state, if we actually get bulldozers in the ground. And I can honestly say to you, I am so confident that will be the case. But, we've got to get on with now the building, not just the talking, truncate a whole heap of processes, and I reckon we can get there. I really do.
If I could make one suggestion from the cheap seats in the media here, I mean, what you really need is a subcommittee of COAG. You can't put it in the hands of the bureaucrats, John. You've seen this issue with the Independent Commission in New South Wales blocking things, and they are unaccountable, unlike MPs. If you had a subcommittee of COAG designed to really build water storages and water management issues along and away from the Murray-Darling Basin, separate to all of that, I think you'd see some political will around the room. And for those that want to duck shove this issue away, like Victoria, the weight of COAG would shame them, at least to have to own up publicly to what they're not doing. But just on the issue I mentioned there about this Independent Planning Commission and the issue of the mine that was knocked back, the Bylong coal mine, what's been the ramifications for that community?
Yeah, look, I have concerns about the IPC, and I've made commentary about that in the public domain. Look, if you're going to knock back a mine, and as the Resource Minister in New South Wales, I have no problem if you're going to knock back a mine based on the science, the data and the facts, if it's to do with water and water catchment, if it's to do about protecting prime agricultural land, and there is merit in that argument, well, by all means, just because you've got an exploration licence, it doesn't necessarily mean you get a mining licence. And therefore, if it's based on that, you'd cop it. But what we've seen creep into the IPC's decisions, from Rocky Hill to a number of recent announcements, and that is this Scope 3 emissions. This is where we as Australia are now saying that if we will approve a mine based on if we're going to accept responsibility for the emissions from the markets we sell to. So if you sell your coal to a market overseas that hasn't signed up to the Paris Agreement or have no emission target, we're now going to count those emissions as Australia's emissions. And if you do that and you talk about intergenerational equity in this formula, you'll never approve another mine. And that is the concerning part. Now, we've made clear directions through the Secretary of the Department that we don't want to see Scope 3 creep into decision-making, and the IPC has disregarded it. So in my mind, we are the elected government. We set policy and the agenda. The IPC must work within that, and if they can't, which they've proven they can't, I think it's time to have a look at the Independent Planning Commission. We are the government, and we must take responsibility.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if what they're saying, what they're basing the decision on is that Australia must be responsible for every bit of coal that leaves Australia and the emissions that coal might generate if burnt overseas. It's a bit like saying that every bottle of wine we export from Australia, whoever drinks it becomes an alcoholic, has some recall on Australia, or every car crash that happens overseas based on a drunk driver, we're somehow responsible. And we know that's laughable. If it went to another export, well, why is coal any different? You said to the government, what can be done about the Independent Commission? Can you order a review, an overhaul? Can you change somehow its structure? Can you legislate out this concept they have brought in relation to these Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, Peter, again, Scope 3 emissions, at the moment we're hearing it in the mining space, but you could argue at some point in the future it could be applied to cattle exports. It could apply to many other industries. And on top of that, as you said, are we going to take responsibility for everything that we do abroad? No, the answer is no. It doesn't pass the pub test, and we believe that. But we're working as a government on finding and putting together legislation to deal with Scope 3. That is the immediate issue in relation to the mining sector. When I became the Resource Minister at the start of this term, I said, I want to make New South Wales the mining investment destination. We have not just coal, but some of the most significant minerals in this state, and I want to see investment. But on these decisions, we're not going to get that confidence. And even though I say that, it's not been delivered through the actions of the government, through the planning system. So there is a need to look at the IPC in relation to timelines, in making decisions, cutting through and making sure those decisions are in line with government policy. We'll do that work. But the immediate issue for us is to put legislation in the House so that we eliminate this creeping in of Scope 3 emissions as part of the decision-making. As I said, I'll cop it on the chin if a mine doesn't get approved based on protecting the water catchments, the agricultural land and other significant factors, but not on Scope 3. But Scope 3 seems to be at the heart of it all. We're focused on it. Let's see what we can achieve in the next few weeks.
Just before we go, two drought-related queries here. We know $100 million was announced by the Prime Minister. I'm not entirely clear that that is all new money. It looks to me to be a bit of a reorganisation. But just on that point, money that has previously been granted by the government for similar programs like this, the federal government to the states, was revealed today that a council who'd received the money said we're not in a drought-affected area, and the Agricultural Minister, David Littleproud's now been forced to order an inquiry as to how that money was allocated. That would concern me. It's over $1 million. But also the question often raised with me too, Deputy Premier, is the issue of donations. So many people pledged donations in the last 12 to 18 months, and we also then hear from communities who say we haven't seen anything like the level of donations promised hit the ground in their communities. What do you say to both of those issues?
Yeah, they're two very good points. Look, firstly, I'll always welcome any new money, small, medium or large amounts coming from the federal government and supporting drought-stricken communities. And you want to make sure that money goes to those communities that are doing it hard. I've travelled my state. Tomorrow I'll be in Cobar for the next couple of days, an area that is struggling from drought. And the reality is we want to make sure the money goes to those communities that are hit hard from the drought. There are communities that will always be under-treated, and when you've got 97% of the state drought declared, you could argue every corner deserves it. But it's degrees of drought and who has been suffering. So I just would love to make sure that the feds are putting the money where it really will make a difference. $1 million to a local government area is significant. I know there's been criticism about that amount, but it is quite significant for a lot of these communities because it means local projects can be completed or started, which means supporting local businesses, suppliers, local tradies. But the other part of it is, even if it's not new money, some of the criticism of the federal programs has been, again, the red tape, the delays in approvals. I know that we have changed our approvals down to about 10 days. And if you've received funding previously, you are automatic in the system. You never have to go through that paperwork trail again. And I hope the feds do that. In relation to the money that Australians have put together and donated for a very worthy cause, firstly, thank you to everybody in Australia for being so generous and supporting our regional rural communities. But again, it hasn't been in a targeted measure. That's not something government has been responsible for, and we trust and rely on those charities. But it's clear as I travel, certain areas seem to get a lot of support and a lot of areas don't. I'm not sure what the wisdom or the form there is around it. And look, I congratulate the charities, but it's difficult. It is difficult, and I don't have an answer on how do you fix it.
Well, I'd be interested in talking to you the next couple of weeks or so when you get back from Cobar, when you've had a good look around on the ground and see if there's anything more we can draw attention to make sure that there is equity in the way in which we're dealing with this issue, both as a community and as many levels of government. But thank you very much for your time, Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Peter.